Hi, I'm Susan Downs and Steve Fowkes is my co-host. Welcome to the Silicon Valley Health Institute. We've been going for about almost 20 years with monthly lectures from some of the world's leading health experts. Our website is www.svhi.com. So to continue with this, currently we're having weekly Zoom meetings because we want to get information out. As was just mentioned, there's a COVID brain where a lot of people are in fear. And then there's a non-COVID brain where we're trying to learn about immunity and keeping ourselves healthy and keeping ourselves strong and good nutrition, etc., which we all think is essential. So tonight we're honored to have Dr. Deanna Minich with me. Sorry if I mispronounced it. I met her in London at a bookstore when she was talking and immediately went up and tried to get her to come on this forum. And so here she is. She is a widely published author, well-known speaker, nutritionist, media personality, and health expert. She holds master's and doctorate degrees in medical science, and she's lectured extensively throughout the world on health topics, teaching patients and health professionals. She's a fellow of the American College of Nutrition, a certified nutrition specialist. Currently, she teaches at the Institute for Functional Medicine and for the graduate program in functional medicine at the University of Western States. Her passion is bringing forth a colorful whole self approach to nourishment and bridging the gaps between science, soul, and the art in medicine. She's published 6 books on health and wellness and over 40 scientific publications. Her books include Whole Detox and The Rainbow Diet. You can find out more about her on her website, www.deannaminich.com. Samples of her presentations can be found at this site. Also, you can look under the press and media section. So welcome, Dr. Minich.
Well, thank you. Good to be here. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And what I'd like to do is provide some information and, of course, break for questions intermittently throughout the presentation so that all the questions don't build up. I think that'll be good to have a little bit of discussion and dialogue along the way so that we all stay engaged. Sometimes it's pretty challenging to stay active on a virtual interface for so long, right? So yes, Susan and I met some time ago, and I was anticipating being down in the Bay Area to deliver this talk, but as it turns out, this is just fine and it's convenient. One of the areas that I have a lot of passion around is that of phytonutrients. So with my background as a nutrition researcher, one of the things that I've noticed is that in the nutrition field, we tend to swing the pendulum between all the macronutrients and not give a lot of attention to things like the small, diverse components in plants. And so I don't advocate a certain diet dogma. I just want to say that up front, that it's not that I'm into being vegan, vegetarian, paleo, keto, omnivore, whatever it is. To me, I just, I look to what is the common denominator and what has the most scientific evidence. And in my opinion, it is looking at phytonutrients, looking at plant-based foods, and just getting more of those into people's diet. So I'm going to tour you through. There's going to be a lot of color in this presentation. This presentation is for education only. It's not for any kind of therapeutic recommendations. And I want to start out with a little bit of the conversation that we were just having before we launched into the presentation, which is that of COVID-19. What makes people susceptible to contracting this viral infection? And there does seem to be some underlying conditions that might predispose people to being a bit more vulnerable. Things like hypertension, diabetes, hyperlipidemia, coronary artery disease, just to name the top ones here, all of which have a lifestyle type of component connected. So this was data that was presented in New York specifically. And so much of these things, I mean, they shared a very similar etiology and mechanism as it relates to inflammation. And many of these phytonutrients that I'm going to talk about actually address those things. The other thing to be thinking about is body composition. not necessarily a higher body mass index, but a disproportionate fat mass to fat-free mass. And so one of the things that we see here is with obesity skyrocketing, body composition changing, and really, again, predisposing the body to a more inflammatory state potentially, and making chronic disease a bit more inviting into that milieu. So one of the things, as I mentioned, that I really like to look at is, what does the scientific evidence say? What can we not arm wrestle? You know, I think that we can arm wrestle dairy, we can arm wrestle meat, we can arm wrestle soy, we can arm wrestle a lot of these basic foods. And, you know, when I get questions all the time, Deanna, what do you think about eggs? Well, there's so many contexts around eggs. What is the person like that's consuming the eggs? What are they consuming it as, with, you know, all of these different things. But the one thing that stays true is the evidence for fruit and vegetable intake reducing the risk of several chronic diseases, everything from dementia to coronary heart disease to type 2 diabetes. So many different lifestyle-induced diseases are connected to the intake of plants. And the beauty of it is that we don't necessarily need a whole lot. I think if we can just even get to the threshold of at least 5 servings per day, we're relatively protected. And so you can see here, this was in the British Medical Journal. You can see how after a certain point of about 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day, that the level of mortality is more or less plateaued. There's a small decrease beyond that. I don't want to suggest that more is not better, because it really depends on what you're displacing in the diet. But in general, if we can get people getting 5 servings per day, this is pretty significant. The reason why plant foods work is because they have a number of different mechanisms that help with the pathology behind chronic diseases. So they have antioxidant potential, they're anti-inflammatory, and I'm going to talk more about the gut microbiome, because this is the new frontier of how there are additive and even synergistic effects of plant-based foods. And in the time of COVID, one of the things that I was spending a lot of my time with was putting together position statements, being on the COVID task force for the Institute for Functional Medicine, looking at what can we be including into the diet in order to help the immune system. I think that that's one of the points of communication that's not coming through very adequately, is we're talking a lot about avoidance in the societal messaging around COVID, and we're not talking about being preventative and proactive in the way of nutrition and lifestyle both together. The other piece that I think is really important, and it's recognizing not just the physical aspects, but looking at stress and what is happening. In fact, I just posted it was a blog from Rolling Stone that was really well done, talking about the social isolation effects of COVID-19 and what's happening as a result of the sympathetic nervous system. And when we feel socially isolated, that translates in the way of physiological markers. For example, inflammatory cytokines can increase in the presence of social isolation. So we can't discount these really important effects as it relates to stress. And the beauty is that fruits and vegetables, eating more of them, actually coincides with less psychological distress and better mood. So not only does it have a physiologic effect on the body, but it also has mood and mind effects as well. So when I look at this was a really nice review article on fruits. I think that many people fear fruit. They think it's going to increase blood sugar, all kinds of different issues there. But what this particular author in this review article was talking about was the benefits of eating fruit because of fiber and other things. And I found that this graph was particularly interesting, showing how with more fruit and vegetable servings per day, there was an increase in life satisfaction. So I think that that doesn't always come across, that it's not just reducing the risk of chronic disease, which seems kind of distant, but also increasing quality of life and how impactful that can be in people's lives. So I'm interested in the common denominators. What can be accessed by most people? What is evidence-based? And so what I think is one of those solutions, and what I'll be presenting to Congress next week, is having an Eat the Rainbow toolkit. How can we have more colorful plant-based foods? So Daniel likes that. Well, one of the things as a scientist that I always look for in the literature is pattern recognition. So it's not just eating the rainbow for the sake of eating the rainbow and that looks nice and pretty and it's memorable. There's actually, what I can see, a science to these different colors. As part of my graduate work, I worked on carotenoids. Carotenoids are the family of 750 different compounds, colorful plant-based compounds in the environment. And what I came to realize is that the colors seem to coincide with functions. So I published this article last year in the Journal of Nutrition and Metabolism. It's a 19-page article, and you can download it. It is open access, and I go through the pattern recognition. I'm essentially going to take that through tonight, and you're going to see how I have codified this color type of systematic approach. But if you want all of the individual studies, you want to see how I put it together scientifically, this would be the article to get. So how do we implement this? I'm a very practical person. I think it's good to know the science, but we need to put it into translation and into motion. And so you'll see at the very end, I have a Eat the Rainbow toolkit, which I will offer to all of you to download for free. It will be the same toolkit that I'll be presenting to Congress next week. And each of the congressional staff is welcome to take it back to their districts to implement. So there's an opportunity to take this much broader. So yeah, food is medicine. I think that all of you are well aware of that, but I think that we need a little bit more context to that. I do think that there's something about the color of foods that makes it medicine. There's something about those individual pigments. And usually I get a tongue-in-cheek type of chuckle when I say the rainbow diet, and then people say, oh, do you mean all of the different colors of candies and cakes and food dyes? And I would say, you know, obviously there's a spectrum, right? And food manufacturers know of the power of color and of that emotional pull to foods. And so of course, there's going to be utilization of color in the way of connecting people to food choices. So this is not what I'm referring to. What I have noticed is that, and I'm sure you have noticed this as well, is that there is much in the way of having a very lackluster type of way of eating, right? So for the most part, when we look at even breakfast, we see brown, yellow, and white foods. Brown, yellow, and white foods. They're everywhere. You look at a restaurant buffet, back when we can go to restaurants, when we were able to do that, right? Not so much anymore, but you look at how foods are prepared. Many times they're made to be more unhealthy through the cooking process, and they're color devoid. They're color devoid. And so I look at food in a very literal and a symbolic way. I think that if we're eating burnt out, lackluster, bland foods, we actually take that on in our bodies. You know, this is a very inflamed looking meal. And I do think that amongst all of the different eating styles, that the way to unify people, so many people use food as a way to divide, as a way to feel more righteous, as a way of feeling superior, or thinking that, you know, they have the one way. And I have been like that myself, because I've studied nutrition, and you start reading some articles and then you start to think, oh, this is how I need to eat. And then soon you realize, well, that's not going to last very long. So what's the common denominator? This is the unifier. I think we need more unifiers rather than polarizers in our society. So how do we connect through plants? And what's really amazing to me, and again, I give credit to my professors in my graduate school days to turning me on to phytonutrients, because I feel like they're the underdogs in nutrition. Usually when people think of nutrition, they think of high fat, low fat, high protein, low protein. We think of the three musketeers. I call them the three musketeers of nutrition: protein, carbohydrate, and fat. And then sometimes we focus on the micronutrients. We think about vitamins and minerals, but rarely do we start to focus on the thousands and thousands of compounds known as phytonutrients, which don't necessarily have calories, but they do have functionality in the body. So when I'm talking about phytonutrients, phyto refers to plant. So here's a short list of where you might find these. And I know that I've already spoke to the fruits and vegetables category, but really there are many different ways to get our phytonutrients: nuts, seeds, nut butters, seed butters, whole grains of various types, different dietary fibers, legumes that are sprouted or need to be cooked, herbs and spices. Herbs and spices, and I would even add to this list teas. You know, if I look at the literature on how can we get phytonutrients, in fact, I just posted it to one of my social media outlets about how a cup of tea rivals the phytonutrient content of even certain vegetables, a serving of vegetables. So not to underestimate even beverages, juices, teas, even coffee is incredibly rich with different phytochemicals. I think a cup of coffee has something on the order of, maybe it was 2,000 different phytochemicals. And so it's significant. And if people are doing these things every day and punctuating their day with beverages that are rich in phytonutrients, this can be substantial. In fact, if I think of all the people taking dietary supplements, you know, oftentimes they don't stay with that supplement, but they can stay with something that is food-based like tea and still be getting a lot of efficacy from that medium. All right, so you might have heard of glycemic index. There's also something on the horizon that I'm really excited about, which is called the phytochemical index. It's actually been around for some years. It's just that it's more in the research and it's not actually in, I would say, not in practice. Like, we don't have apps that just focus on phytochemical index. So with the phytochemical index, or PI, this basically speaks to the density of phytonutrients in a food. So the greater the PI, the greater the phytonutrient content per caloric amount. But I can envision that eventually we walk into a store, a grocery store, we have our phone, our smartphone, and we scan foods for their phytochemical index. Not just their antioxidants, but we're actually looking more broadly at the whole spectrum. And there is one particular app that I'm aware of that is starting to head down this path, but I do think that we can be using technology to start to estimate exactly how much in the way of a therapeutic potential that a food has. So phytochemical index is interesting because it's starting to be associated with different markers like body weight, waist circumference, and even some markers of inflammation. So it's out there, it's being discussed. I do think that even the USDA nutrient database, they're starting to track things like proanthocyanidins, isoflavones, carotenoids. It's starting, but it's not like it's on a supplement facts panel. It's not on a nutrition facts panel. So we are limited by metrics and what's currently available to us. So one of the aspects that I do want to speak on too is that of the personalized effects. So one of the organizations that I'm involved with, I'm a board member, is the American Nutrition Association, which is really got its stake in the ground on personalized nutrition. And we wrote a position paper on what is personalized nutrition. And one of the features of personalized nutrition is genes, genetics. How do we take somebody's genetic constitution and symptomatology, as well as environment, their preferences, all of these things, and how do we start to put all of those things together into a way that speaks to a particular dietary pattern that's well suited to them? And we're learning much more about genes. Keep in mind that the Human Genome Project finished basically in around 2003. We are just out of the gate on that, more or less scientifically. I know that people become enamored with genomics, but I do think that the more that you find out about genomics and epigenomics, the more you realize how little we actually do know. and how much we need to know in order to start to codify nutrition solely within that realm. I think it still needs to be connected to other things. So one of the exciting pieces of phytochemicals, I'm really excited about the functionality, because at the end of the day, we just want to see what they do. Some of these phytochemicals are found in certain parts of the body. They localize there. I'm going to talk about the different colors and where they go in the body. At the level of the cell, and I did some of this work with Dr. Jeff Bland and the research team when I was at Metagenics. We looked at certain phytonutrients and how they change cellular function. So changing gene expression, and how do they change? I mean, even something like broccoli, cruciferous vegetables, they start to get in and start to make modifications that are more epigenetic rather than, you know, they're not changing base pairs, they're changing the conformation of the genes, which is changing ultimately their expression. So I think that this is a whole exciting array of, gosh, you know, it's exploration. And right now, I often ask people, and we can just even take a pause here if you want, and just to see, have people had their genome sequenced? Have you had your SNPs? You know, there's a difference between getting your whole genome sequenced versus going to something like 23andMe and getting a certain amount of gene variants sequenced. So I do think, you know, it's valuable information. It's something that it doesn't change. So you get it done once and you take it and you can bring it into many of your medical encounters. And I don't think many medical doctors really understand how to work with all of those data, but I think it's worthwhile to start to bring it into the discussion and start to do some exploration on our own. Would anybody like to say anything about just measurements of gene variants in general? Just wanted to pause on that because it's such a hot topic. Okay. All right. So many of you might be thinking, well, gosh, she's just going to tell me to eat more fruits and vegetables. And I don't need studies to tell me that. But if you look widespread, what you see is that people just aren't doing it. So there's a translation problem. There's an implementation problem. This study was done by Nutrilite Health Institute back in 2009. Basically, when they surveyed people, they found that most people are not meeting their phytonutrients every day. And the color that they're missing out most on is blue-purple. And you're going to see that blue-purple in the color-coded system that I've identified and published on is actually the color that coincides with the brain, with neurological health, with brain function, with cognition, with mood, mind, and memory. So we'll get more into that. Any other comments before we get into each of the colors? So we're going to do a deep dive into each color, what it means, how all the different foods align to those different phytonutrients.
I have a question, but I don't know if this is something that might be better left to the end. It has to do with the issue of color selections that might be based on taste and food appearances versus color selections that might be based on personality and creative processes. And have you noticed any kind of correlation between those?
So you're asking about more a person's preference in terms of what colors they like and what they're drawn to versus how do colors coincide with the chemosensory properties of food?
Yeah, so for example, you know, there are various color tests that you can do, like the Lucia color test. It was developed by Dr. Lucia in Germany, I can't remember how many decades ago, where the way in which you process certain key colors, which he calls primary colors, in terms of your preferences, have to do with various things that go on in your personality, in your life, and maybe even the traumas that you might have experienced. And that, so I'm just wondering whether or not the human mind has a connection between color perception and nutritional or metabolic guidance, like we might have for being able to taste something like copper or zinc if we have those kinds of deficiencies.
Daniel, did you want to say something to that?
Yeah, well, there's SNPs that like there's a cilantro SNP that's some people don't eat cilantro because it tastes like dirt. And it's
Yeah, like soap, right? Yeah, I've heard that from a number of people.
yeah, you can do the tests. And there's also a mind-body connection where, first of all, your bacteria in your gut eat first. And so they may be telling you what your preferences are based upon what bacteria or fungus is in the gut. So, you know, and that's not to be underestimated. And then the next part is that most people don't do embodied eating. So their body doesn't really experience the meal. And because they're watching TV, fast food, fast life, and or they may be addicted to some sugar and they eat that and it becomes alcohol and they're addicted to that in their gut. And so it can be really complicated that way. So those things take place. And then also in like Ayurveda, we look at the different tastes. And for instance, a lot of the chronic diseases, you want to use the more bitter, astringent flavors to treat those things. So there's a lot of different, and that depends on your body type. And we can keep going on and on and on, but I don't want to take over this amazing doctor here, Deanna, so I'll hand it over to her.
Well, Daniel, all of those comments are great. And you're right, you're connecting the dots and starting to see the crosstalk. I think to answer your question, which is a great one, Stephen, is I don't think that we've actually ever explored that. There's a body of literature on color theory and color perception in the psychological journals. And then there are colors in the medical journals as they relate to foods, but the two do not seem to do much crosstalk, or at least I haven't seen that. But you know,
let me ask you a personal question then. Since you do art, I also do art, and very connected to color. And have you ever seen changes in your color preferences for food that reflect in your art?
Wow, this is really, I don't think I've ever had that amazing question. So I would like to tell you a little bit about my personal story of how I got into color, because it was not just my research. Something else happened to me. So when I was a teenager, I started to develop a condition it's endometriosis, which is an inflammatory condition of the uterus. And so I have a family history of that. And so I just kind of assumed, oh, I'm just going to have problems with this my whole life, right? A lot of reproductive health issues. Well, you know, I was always interested in science and trying to figure out, like, why do I have this endometriosis? And so as I got into science and I was in grad school, I was always very interested in other disciplines because I didn't feel that I could learn everything just from science alone. So I started taking philosophy courses. I took art history. I was a literature minor. I studied English lit. And so poetry and science were kind of like fusing together within me, right? And I started to study yoga. I took a world religions course. And one of the things that happened to me in my late 20s when I was finishing my PhD is I was in one of my very emotional, stressful moments, and I started to paint. I started to see color in different ways. You know, I felt like my life was very gray in the way of like having all this stress. So on a weekend, I went to the art store, and I'm not trained in art or anything like that, but I bought a big roll of paper. And I just got on the ground and I started to paint really bright colors. I painted red and yellow in an outline of black. And it was a very distinct design. And I put it up on my wall. And I realized how good I felt from that experience. It was like, oh my gosh, these colors, you know, I was in this space of no mind. I really kind of lost myself in that coherent moment of like really being connected to something deeper within me. So time went on and I still had not resolved my reproductive health issues, but I noticed that every time I felt emotional, and to your point about color, I felt drawn to paint the colors orange and pink. Orange and pink. I would never wear them, but I had to paint them. And it was like, almost like, you know, Picasso goes through his blue period or the rose period. It was like I was doing orange and pink all the time. And I was doing certain designs. And so it was late one night and I was in my 30s and I was painting on a Saturday night. And my husband says to me, Deanna, I think you're painting your ovaries and your uterus and you're putting it all over the house. And it's the same pattern. You're making these spirals and it's the same color. Exactly. I didn't even see this. And so I said, Mark, I think you're right. I think this orange and pink, I'm going to start intentionally painting and connecting into my body. So mind you, I was lecturing to medical doctors on women's health, and I had endometriosis and I had a blocked fallopian tube because of this chronic condition that had worsened, and I couldn't solve it. And every year I had to go to the doctor and get scanned. So anyway, I said, you know what, Mark, I was telling my husband, I said, I think you're right. Something's going on. I'm doing everything. I take supplements. I watch my diet. I get physical activity. I go to a chiropractor. I get massage. I'm doing it all. Nothing is moving the dial. So I made all these paintings. I had an art gallery showing. I had friends and family. It was small. It was just at a friend's gallery, but I had friends and family come and see the paintings. That year, I got scanned like I always do. And my fallopian tube was unblocked. My uterus, according to the gynecologist, was beautiful. Yes, it was like, and I cannot say that art healed me, but there was something that clicked because I did not have a condition that was easily remedied after having it so long. And I don't know if art and color just brought me into this state of this connection to like not being stressed, or maybe I released something from my body, maybe I expressed something, but I became so in tune with color to the point that I started seeing people as color. I would paint them as a color on a canvas. And then I started to pay attention to foods. I started paying attention to what I was wearing. Everything in my environment became color. And I realized the medicine of that for me and how healing it was. So your point is really good. And I wasn't sure about this group and how much to go into that kind of a thing, but there's not just the science of color that I'm talking with you about tonight. I mean, really, I am going to be focused on the science, but there's an art. There's an art of creative expression that color invites us to. I do think that color provokes us emotionally. It drives behavior. It changes our action. You know, you look at a red stop sign, you look at a red stoplight, you look at a red ambulance, red fire hydrant. All of these things are giving us cues as to what that symbolizes: urgency, emergency. So I think that there's a brilliance to color, and nature started that ball rolling with plant foods. So anyway, a long-winded answer, but I felt like your questions were very provoking and created a space for me to really get into how it's almost like the science and the spirituality of color, quite honestly. There's something more to color, and you being an artist yourself, I mean, we're all artists, truly. It's just that maybe it doesn't manifest as a painting. It could manifest in many different ways, but I think that color is something we want to stay in tune with.
Any connection with the colors associated with the chakras?
I like this group already. Yes, and I don't talk about chakras specifically because I feel like some people are limited by that word and they don't understand it. My first book was called Chakra Foods, and that was because of the publisher, and I did not want to call it that. But yes, when I started taking yoga, and then I realized, my goodness, what we're really talking about with chakras is the neuroendocrine system. We're talking about the adrenals, the ovaries, testes, the pancreas, the heart. We're talking about the thyroid. And then I started to see that these colors that had these associations with the neuroendocrine system actually had food associations within the science. So yes, you're astute, Susan, in terms of, I mean, this is my operating system, is to look at I call them 7 systems. These aren't loyal to the chakra system. So that's why I don't feel, and I've been criticized for people that focus on chakras and they say, oh, she's doing chakras and food. But I don't say that I'm doing this here. These are, I've observed some different patterns that I've brought in. So yeah.
Yeah, because the red is associated with energizing and the lower chakras. And what I find interesting is the people you get along with usually have, here we go, an aura color similar to your own. Here we go.
Okay, all right. I like this group. They're very expansive. Okay, so, well, let's go through the colors, and I'd like you all to see which colors you resonate with. I'm teaching a 7-month course right now where we spend a month or 4 weeks on each color, and we go deep. And what I'm finding, we're on orange right now, and it's really interesting because many of the women don't eat orange foods. And I'm going to talk about why that's a problem and why we would want orange foods. So let's go through each of the, and I'll stop after each color, and you all can comment as to your perceptions on that color and what you've observed for yourself. So let's get into red. Red is a supercharged color. In some ways, red is, I see it as the color of survival. I see it as the color of the adrenals. It is the color of inflammation. And what's interesting is that red colored foods are somewhat of a double-edged sword because some of them can cause inflammation and others are anti-inflammatory. So if we think, and I'll get into this, but strawberries, nightshades, tomatoes, high histamine foods, what happens to the body? We actually turn red. Red is a sign from nature that we need to be alerted. It's getting our attention, right? So I do think about the color code of red foods being connected to inflammation and the immune system, because inflammation is connected to immunity. If we want to bolster the immune system and create that sense of reducing inflammatory noise, potentially what we need to do is increase red colored foods. I think of all things red in the body. Blood, I think of structural components, and I won't get as much into that. I want to stick with, you know, red and looking at adrenals. So what I have here is a short list. On the left are fruits. On the right are different vegetables, root vegetables, and in some cases, botanically, they might be seen as a fruit. So don't get too stuck on that. But these are just a wide array of different red colored plant-based foods. And I'm going to tour you through some of the research on them. There's a plethora of different phytochemicals that you find in red foods. And one of the ones that I studied when I was in grad school is lycopene. And this was in the 1990s when we didn't really know a lot about carotenoids or lycopene and how tomato paste is a better source of lycopene than a raw tomato. And you need fat to absorb lycopene. Lycopene is really helpful for the prostate as well. It's helpful for skin cancer. In fact, I just posted a new study on my Facebook page talking about lycopene supplementation and improvements in skin health and skin aging. The beauty of some of these carotenoids is that they're fat soluble. So they go into the epidermis, they go into the skin, they go into the fatty parts of the body, and they act as an antioxidant. So it's almost like you get an internal sunscreen. So then there are anthocyanins, lots of different things that they do. Astaxanthin is another carotenoid typically found in shellfish. So they eat things that are red that make them red. You think of shrimp, you think of krill, these types of things, you know, lobster and crustaceans in general, they take that red color on. So one of the things that I noticed is that red foods tend to be, not exclusively, but they tend to be higher in vitamin C. So what we did here is we went to the USDA nutrient database. We just did a search on what are the highest foods in vitamin C. And up at the top of the list was acerola cherry juice. Now this is not very common. It's very bitter. Many people just don't have acerola juice like that. But if you think of vitamin C chewable tablets, which I don't love because they tend to be high in sugar, but typically they're using acerola as part of those chewables. Rose hips, yes, orange juice is also on here, guavas, peppers, tomato juice. These are some things that tend to be high in vitamin C, and they tend to be orange or red. Not exclusively again, but up at the top of the list, a lot of these red foods. Amla fruit. So Daniel mentioned Ayurvedic medicine. So amla is a very important berry in Ayurveda. Also extremely rich in vitamin C. So tomatoes, some people can do tomatoes and other people can't do tomatoes. I think about, at least clinically from what I could see, about 10 to 15% of people have a nightshade intolerance. They provoke inflammation rather than reduce inflammation. They might get joint inflammation. It could manifest in many different ways in the body. You know, I think the jury is still out on, is that a lectin issue? Is that just something else in the nightshade itself? So it's just, I think we have to take a personalized approach. So tomato juice. Many people ask me about juice, and people are concerned about juice because they think of the sugar impact. But you know what? There are a number of studies looking at juice, whether it's pomegranate juice, cranberry juice, tomato juice, a lot of these red juices being very important for including into a meal, even in small amounts, to help offset any kind of inflammatory response of a meal. So if people consume juice, what I tend to tell them is just make sure that you're taking it within the context of a meal so you don't have a glycemic response. Now, this study was done in people that were overweight or obese. These were women. They were allocated to an intervention group or a control group, which had either the tomato juice or water for 20 days. And what these researchers looked at were markers of inflammation like interleukin-8, TNF-alpha, and what they showed was that these particular inflammatory markers decreased significantly in the tomato juice group compared with just having water. And for the people who were overweight, who might tend to be more inflamed just naturally, keep in mind that the adipose tissue produces upwards of 30 different adipokines. So and that's why these researchers were studying these particular people, because they might tend towards inflammation. When we think of tomatoes in general, lycopene, I'm a food first kind of person. So I like the tomato juice concept. I like the tomato paste concept. I'm not as big of a fan of all of the supplements, but I do recognize that there's a place for supplements. I think even people eating the healthiest diet still may need some supplemental support because our environment is toxic, our soils are depleted. So in this particular study, this was looking at, I believe that this is an animal study showing that lycopene in tomato products decreased high fat induced pro-inflammatory cytokine expression in the liver. So there's something about lycopene in terms of reducing inflammation. And if you look at the heart studies, cardiovascular disease risk, lycopene consumption seems to be important. Strawberries are another food that seem to be connected to an anti-inflammatory effect. Now, some people react to strawberries because they are high in histamine. What breaks down histamine? Vitamin C. Isn't that interesting how it's all kind of connected into this whole pattern here? So this was a small study, 14 overweight healthy adults in a 3-arm crossover trial. They had a strawberry drink at 3 different time points. It was 2 hours before a meal, with the meal itself, and then 2 hours after a meal. And what they found was that IL-6, one of the inflammatory cytokines, was significantly lower after consuming the strawberry drink before the meal. So it's almost like priming the body, having that anti-inflammatory signal before the meal arrives. You know, there's a time factor. You know, that's what we're finding in nutrition, is that it's not just what you eat, it's when you eat it. Chrononutrition, chronosupplementation. Should we be taking supplements at certain times of the day? So I like this study for the point of understanding strawberries as an anti-inflammatory, but then also when to take it. When do you couple foods together? I think that there's a whole science of how to eat smarter by coupling and creating synergy with foods taken at different times. I don't think we fully understand that. A lot of the traditional medical systems understand that, but we've lost a lot of that along the way. Here's another study on strawberries. And again, they used a strawberry beverage that was freeze-dried or control. And what they found in this, again, a small study, these are people with osteoarthritis of the knee. And they found that of the markers that they studied, a variety of different inflammatory markers, that they were decreased after having the strawberry versus control. And that was within 12 weeks' time. Strawberry supplementation significantly reduced constant, intermittent, and total pain. So one of the hallmarks of inflammation is pain. Rubor, color, dolor, redness, pain, heat, swelling, and even tumor, right? And so what we see in some of these studies is that indeed we're seeing the calming of the redness, the calming of the pain with these red foods. This is an intriguing study, again, very small, but I get questions about beet juice. Deanna, is that too high in sugar? Should I be doing beet? And right now, beet is really prevalent even as a supplement for athletes, helping with opening the blood vessels, reducing oxidative damage. Tart cherry juice is being used to reduce oxidative stress, right? You probably have heard about that. So in this study, they looked at people who were inflamed. They had hypertension. High blood pressure is truly inflammation, right? Inflammation of the vasculature. And, or, you know, many different mechanisms, but ultimately is getting to inflammation. So these researchers were wanting to know, is beet juice equal to having the same amount of cooked beets? So how does that impact blood pressure? So that was a crossover design, 24 people with hypertension. They took each food or beverage for 2 weeks, washed out for 2 weeks, and then they switched. And what they found was that the lipids improved more with the juice, but both were equal when it came to inflammation. So I always say, just shake it up. It doesn't matter if you will like the juice or you prefer the root one day. It's not like, I always advocate variety, 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 and how important that is, not just in food, but in format. Because when you juice a food, you get different actives than when you're having the root of a food. And even like the stem and the beet greens, I mean, there's so many different aspects we could go into here, but looking at the whole plant and the different medicine that it brings in. This was a study on blood orange juice, which is kind of that reddish orange color, versus vitamin C, looking at DNA damage in blood cells. It was only with 7 healthy people. They gave them a single portion of blood orange juice and compare that to a drink supplemented with the same amount of vitamin C or sugars. And what they found was that the DNA damage significantly decreased 3 hours after the juice intake and remained constant at 24 hours. There was no effect of just having vitamin C in a drink or just having a sugar-controlled drink. There's something about the other constituents of the blood orange juice. So another case for juice, and why, you know, I again am an advocate of all plant-based foods in moderation, and not against juice, not against fruit. I think it can be used medicinally. You probably already know this already, but apple peels, the peel of a food, of a plant-based foods, tends to be higher in phytonutrients. So when it comes to an apple, you're going to get most of the phytonutrients, the red part or the green part, if it's a Granny Smith or a green apple, are going to be higher. And in fact, this was published in the New York Times. The researcher who did this is Joe Robinson, who has a great book called Eating on the Wild Side. And what she did was put together a lot of the research from a variety of different studies, and found that different apples are not all created equal in terms of their phytonutrient content. So what she found comparatively was that a Gala apple was higher than a Granny Smith, was higher than a Fuji apple. Does that mean that you should never select a Golden Delicious apple because it looks subpar? No, it's just you get different types of phytochemicals to rotate, rotate, rotate. And we now know of the prebiotic effects of apples, and creating things like stewed apples, you know, cooking them a bit, allowing the fiber to break down a bit more. So apples are great. So where do they tie into this system of inflammation? Well, they help to support the immune system. You probably know of quercetin. Quercetin has been talked about for COVID. It's rich in the white fleshy part of the apple. So we know that. And this is another study in which they looked at apple peel polyphenols. So in many of these studies, what they did is they would take apple peel and then dry it and then give it to people, or they would test it in a cell model. And in this one in particular, looking at just more of a cellular kind of a redox potential, it helped with down-regulating inflammatory pathways just by looking at the apple peel itself. There are other studies that I'm not all stating here, but there are a number of different ones on apple. In fact, I just have to say this. There was a study, I think it came out last year, showing how, gosh, one apple, I think it was something like 100 million microorganisms that you get from an apple. So if we think of like the microbiome and how do we fortify and enrich the biome, whether it's the gut microbiome or various microbiomes, an apple is really rich. And these researchers looked at different parts of an apple and found that it varied So they looked at things like the seed versus the calyx versus the skin versus the stem. It was really fascinating to look at how the microorganisms within an apple, the diversity was quite variable. Rooibos. So if we're talking about teas, I used to live in the Netherlands, and rooibos tea, rooi means red, bos is tree, so red tree. You know, if we think of South Africa, this is a very popular tea in South Africa as well. Rooibos decreased glucocorticoid levels, and this was, again, in vivo, so I was looking in more of an animal model. So again, reducing the stress response, right? And that's what I'm showing us here with the color red, reducing inflammation, quelling the immune system, reducing the stress response. So it's almost like a homeopathic type of like begets like. Like if we can bring in the redness, we can quell the redness. Just it happens to work in this particular case. Back to the apple peel. This was a study in which they found that, I believe this was in a clinical trial, finding that I think it was about 5 grams that they gave, showing that it helped to increase joint function and range of motion. So, you know, looking at dehydrated apples and the peel especially, don't throw out those peels. The only thing that I want you to remember is that the peel of an apple tends to be very toxic. So if we look at the environmental working group and we look at the highly toxic fruits and vegetables, apple is pretty high on the list. So even if you buy an organic apple, just wash it really well, because I mean, we have apple trees in our backyard, and they always seem to collect the resins in the environment. Like, even though they're not sprayed, they're not treated, the coating, the surface of an apple seems to take on things. So especially oily things. So make sure that you wash it well with an emulsifier or some kind of something that cleans it up quite well, something soapy. I mentioned lycopene for prostate. Again, that literature is out there. This was also looking at cardiovascular, a larger study. This was the women's health study of almost 40,000 women, and showing that the risk of developing any form of cardiovascular disease was inversely proportional to the long-term plasma lycopene concentration. So, you know, tomatoes, strawberries, apples, cherries. Cherries are another one, right? You probably know of cherries for gout. You know, we keep in our refrigerator here at home just even a bottle of tart cherry juice. We have it from Michigan State. Believe it or not, Michigan is they're the forerunners in producing Montmorency cherries. And cherries are fascinating because they're a natural source of melatonin. In fact, there was a study showing how I think it was the juice helping with insomnia. Maybe it was because of the melatonin. Maybe it's because of quelling inflammation. I'm not sure, and I don't think we fully understand it. So this was showing how sweet Bing cherries, which are in season right now, if you live in the Northern Hemisphere, lower circulating concentrations of markers for inflammation in healthy people. In healthy people, you know, this wasn't even in diseased people. It was a small study. 18 men and women supplemented their diets with about 280 grams per day. Like, that's not a small amount of cherries. So for 28 days, they had that. And they looked at a number of different markers. They looked at advanced glycation end products, which is a marker of inflammation, C-reactive protein, ferritin, plasminogen activator inhibitor 1, so PI1, endothelin 1, EGF, and IL-18, and saw reductions in all of them, which is pretty substantial just by eating cherries, just by cherries. Here's another one, helping with the effect from exercise. Exercise can be injurious if we're not well equipped from a mitochondrial standpoint, right? So we can actually create oxidative stress. So in this study with 16 soccer players, they gave them placebo, or they gave them tart cherry concentrate, 30 milliliters twice per day, and found that they recovered better. They had less muscle soreness and less of an acute inflammatory response. All right, so let me pause because I gave a lot on red. There's a lot on red, And so again, the connections between red foods, vitamin C, reducing inflammation, looking at the immune system, looking at adrenals, survival. So any questions about red before we go on to orange?
We did have a question earlier about eating fruits and vegetables via smoothies and shakes, and some say good versus others say bad. The blending is too fine, higher glycemic index. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Variety. You know, if you do a smoothie one day, if you want to do a juice another, you're getting different things. Usually juices are higher in minerals, and usually smoothies are higher in fibers. Yes, they're particulates. Yes, you can have a higher glycemic impact, but then put something else in it to blunt it. So bringing in protein, bringing in fat can offset that glycemic impact. So again, I think the variety will give you different levels of nutrients. Are you all eating enough red colored foods? Do you find as I start talking about these and then you start thinking, oh, wow, I haven't had cherries, or maybe I need to up my tomatoes and have some tomato juice, right? I think it's a small step in the direction of, again, creating change. We're so focused, especially during COVID, right? We're wanting to reduce the inflammatory noise. How do we have more of these red colored foods to help us do that?
We have a question about a specific color for seasonal allergy, and I don't know if maybe you can even talk about seasonal aspects of colored foods in general.
Oh, wow. Another great point. Yes, we need to focus on season and seasonality of food. So there are just a handful of studies, not looking at color, but looking specifically at how if we have cherries or grapes, cherries as a springtime food, grapes as an autumn food, and if we feed them to, in these studies, they were looking at animals, you can actually provoke different hypothalamic responses, different changes in appetite based on they do it by photo period. So they try to mimic autumn or spring in these animals by changing their light and dark cycle. And when they feed cherries or grapes, they can see a difference in their metabolism just based on their changes in photoperiod. So I do think that when it comes to allergy, I mean, let's just go with apples for a second. When are apples ripe? September. I know in my yard, my trees are overflowing in September. When do allergies, especially seasonal environmental allergies, crop up? When kids are going back to school, when the weather starts to get cooler. It's at September, October. I do think that nature does equip us with what we need seasonally if we're paying attention, especially in the environment that we live in. So I love that question. I do think that, you know, there was another study in which they looked at oranges grown in the northern hemisphere and in the southern hemisphere, showing how there was a difference of something like 39 different phytochemicals depending on where it was grown, and how each of those oranges provoked different responses in an animal model, just because of this difference of 39 different phytochemicals. So we need to pay attention to that. I think we need to get back to nature, right? I think that this whole situation with COVID is bringing us back, or at least I hope it is. I hope it's a reset in some ways. All right, anything else at this point before we move on to orange?
Orange it is.
Orange it is. Here we go into orange, and orange is all about hormones. It's about reproductive health. Why was I continually painting in orange? Because I had some issues with my hormones, and orange is kind of a sexy color. If you look at nature and biology, when certain animals are ready to mate, they have a way to physically make themselves more alluring. So guppies, during their mating time, they become more orange. They have a higher level of carotenoids in their gills. Certain birds, their plumage becomes more orange, again, when it's time for mating. So orange is a warm color, you know, whereas I think of red as it's a passionate color, but it's also a color of urgency and emergency. Orange is a color of warmth. It's the color of carotenoids. again, mating color. And if you look at studies, which I'm going to show you, there seems to be some correlation with hormones. So there isn't as long of a list of orange foods as there are of red colored foods. But if we look at the fruits, which are very much in season right now in the summer, in fact, I had an apricot today. But if you look at many of these, blood orange, cantaloupe, kumquat, mandarin, mango, nectarines, oranges, papaya, passion fruit, peaches, persimmons, tangerines, you're going to see some of the research that support certain of these orange foods and connections into things like female reproductive health. And then there are also certain starchy tubers. So when those foods are not in season, like the tropical, more, I would say, water-rich orange foods that are more citrusy or tropical, then we move over into the starchy orange tubers. So beta carotene. We usually think of beta carotene, but don't forget that there are lots of carotenoids. There are hundreds. Usually beta carotene gets the limelight because it converts to vitamin A. Alpha carotene does, but not with the same efficiency. Bioflavonoids are also rich in orange foods. And if we look at the top carotenoid containing foods, and we went into the USDA database and just search for the whole class of carotenoids, not beta carotene, but the whole class of different carotenoids, these are the top 10 foods. Dehydrated carrots are pretty high. I mean, look at this, 106,000. Kale is rich in carotenoids. Carrots cooked with butter. Again, carotenoids need fat. So when we think of orange, think of fat, think of lipid, think of, you know, many of these are fat soluble, so they need the vehicle of fat to get into the body. This is one of my paintings, actually. As you can see, it was orange and pink. So as I started looking into carotenoids, and this didn't come about in my grad school days, this came about later, looking at some of the research on ovarian tissue, and how when researchers were studying in this particular study, they looked at 100 women, they analyzed their ovarian tissue and found that it wasn't just one carotenoid in the ovary. There were up to 14 different varieties of carotenoids. Here's the complexity, right? Including the provitamin A. Why is it with ovulation? So what makes a woman fertile is that process of going from corpus luteum, which in Latin, yellow body. Yellow body because of the concentration of carotenoids, retinol, that genomically then connect into corpus albicans, white body. So there's the depletion of that yellow-orange color in the whole follicular process, the maturation process, the genomic process that confers fertility. It's fascinating to me. And what you also find with the menstrual cycle is that antioxidants flux throughout the month. So this is why we have to be very cognizant of when people do laboratory tests. When you just go in and you get your lipids taken, right? You have to sync that up at the same time. For a premenopausal woman, it's really important to be sure that there's consistency, congruency, because there's so much flux and hormones are syncing up with antioxidants. This was a study in 259 women for up to 2 menstrual cycles, so roughly 2 months. Antioxidants were measured 5 to 8 times during their cycle, and they found a correlation between retinol, which is the preformed vitamin A, and alpha tocopherol. These two were associated with higher estradiol. Ascorbic acid was associated with higher progesterone. What an interesting association, right? That these would form these tandems. So maybe there's some type of, I don't think we understand that relationship. It was simply an association, but here's the point. The point is that there are certain relationship. What is nutrition? Nutrition is relationship. It's zinc and copper together. It's calcium and magnesium. How do they relate to each other? What is the ratio, right? Nutrition is always about relationship. This was also looking at fruit and vegetable consumption and risk of endometriosis. Large study, over 70,000 premenopausal women, the Nurses' Health Study. And what they found was that citrus fruits seem to have a particular lowering risk for endometriosis, a 22% lower risk of endometriosis. Additionally, this was another study showing that oranges, mandarins, and peaches, all of which are high in a carotenoid called beta-cryptozanthin. Many people don't hear about beta-cryptozanthin. You hear about beta-carotene, but you don't hear about beta-cryptozanthin. Well, there is some very nice literature looking at beta-cryptozanthin levels being higher, reducing the onset or the decay or the senescence of the ovaries, giving women a little bit more vitality just from eating orange foods. And it's amazing how many women are not eating orange fruits. I'm seeing a pattern. Higher intake of beta-cryptozanthin is also related to lower body mass index and body fat. Keep in mind that because these carotenoids are fat soluble, they're going to have a relationship with the fat tissue. So this was a study, and again, it was just an association study, so not causal. 88 women showing consumption differences between high and low BMI, and looking at body fat percentage, and no other nutritional marker that they studied was as impactful as looking at beta-cryptozanthin. Why don't we measure these in labs, right? This is often what I wonder is, we need to be measuring these along with all of the other standard markers. When somebody goes in to measure hormones, they should be looking at carotenoids. They need to be looking at antioxidants and start to make those associations. All right, so there's also this study, which I found very fascinating, looking at colorectal cancer. High total intake of fruits and vegetables, of course, were associated with reduced risk. Green and white seem to be protective for both men and women. Red and purple fruits and vegetables were protective for women, but not for men. But this is really interesting, and I'm not sure why this is. Here's where it ties into orange. In men, orange, yellow vegetables and fruits was linked to an increased risk. And so what I ask, when I think of beta carotene, right, you remember the Finnish smoker study in 1995, where they found that giving supplemental beta carotene led to increased rates of lung cancer in these smokers versus those who did not have. So I often ask, keep in mind antioxidants can be pro-oxidants depending on the milieu. So what is the environment in the gut? Are we creating dysbiosis? And then these antioxidants come in, and potentially there might be some type of a changing of their nature, a more pro-oxidant effect. I don't know. Mechanistically, I don't think we quite know this. And again, this was just looking at an association of different colors in the risk of cancer, colorectal cancer. Papaya, whenever you can get papaya, and if you can eat papaya and you're not allergic to latex fruit, I would say go for it, because papaya is very bioavailable. First of all, it has enzymatic activity, so that's good. But the bioavailability of beta carotene is greater from papayas than it is from carrots and tomatoes. Lycopene is also more bioavailable, just as a raw fruit versus tomatoes. That's raw tomatoes. So I think papaya is really a wonderful food if you can access it and if it's in season. Keep in mind, because these carotenoids like fat tissue, the color of the skin can change. And there are some studies in which they show people of different skin color actually showing differences in hydration. Skin will change in texture and even slightly in color. If people eat too much in the way of carrots, many times they can get a darkening of the palms, right? So that the hands and the feet can start to darken and collect more of those carotenoids. Not necessarily a clinically urgent condition, but yeah, it can just store in the body. And in some cases, we have more of a genetic predisposition to doing that. All right, any questions about orange before we move on to yellow? Anybody else like orange? Daniel does? You eating some orange foods?
Those of you that have your chat window open, if you'd like to raise your hand, I can then unmute you. Go ahead. Was that Daniel that was talking?
No, I just said I think diversity is the way to go. We need diversity. All
It is.
the colors, all the flavors, all the textures.
So important. Absolutely. I'm going to talk about variety too, a little bit more on the science of it. It looks like Audrey is raising her hand. Audrey, did you want to share anything?
I'm asking her to unmute, and it doesn't appear that it's working.
Got it.
There she goes.
All right.
Hi there. Any thoughts on food combining? There was combining certain fruits. Starchy fruits don't combine with sweet fruits, vegetables, that type of thing.
Yeah, you know, it's a good question, and I get that question a lot. And there's kind of a traditional lineage around food combining. Here's my feeling on it. There is no science that I'm aware of to support food combining, but what I have noticed clinically is that because people have impaired digestion, and you know, gut healing is such a primary aspect of getting our whole health into alignment. And so the more complexity we have with certain foods, the more, and if we don't have a robust digestive system and digestive capacity, we can be more compromised with how we are digesting foods. But truly, in my opinion, nature is diverse, just like Daniel was saying. Foods have a variety of different compounds. It has, you know, whether different macros, different micros. And so I think that we build resilience when we can bring in these pulsed amounts of a variety of different foods even together. So I think food combining has its place as a therapeutic strategy for people who are healing their gut. So I see that especially with people with autoimmune type of conditions where they have many food restrictions. Sometimes they don't have enzymatic sufficiency. So they have to really just do small portions of food, set foods, and they can only combine certain foods and they feel good with that. But I do think that a healthy digestive tract, one that is resilient and functional, should be well equipped to take on a variety of different macro, micro, and phytonutrients simultaneously.
Great. Thank you.
You bet. All right, you ready for yellow? You know, it's interesting, the research on yellow, now we move into the gut. So Audrey, that was a great question and great segue to take us into yellow. Let me just mention before I get into the food aspects. So there was a study in Manchester, England some time ago where they developed what's called the Manchester color wheel. And they would ask people what color did they like the most. And it was just like a whole palette of different colors. And what they found was that people who were not anxious or depressed tended towards this color number 14, which was this color that you're seeing before you. It was like this bright yellow, sunny color. People love this color yellow. There's something invigorating. They relayed, you know, this sense of being happy. They also asked children about their favorite color, and many children liked this color yellow and said how it reminded them of their birthday or like a happy time. So yellow is, I mean, look at a smiley face, you know, the kind of the iconic smiley with the eyes and the smile, right? Yellow. I think yellow has its place. I think yellow has been misused in the food industry. Like if you look at cakes and bagels and breads and chips, I mean, look at how many things are yellow that lure us and that burn us out. So popcorn and all of the corn, right? It's almost like we've had an inundation of unhealthy yellow. So when I think of yellow, I think of carbohydrate. Just like when I thought of red, I'm thinking of vitamin C. I'm thinking of, I didn't get into all of the associations there, but orange, I think of fats. But yellow, I think of carbohydrates, things that burn bright, and either it gives us quick energy or it's sustainable energy. So I associate yellow with the digestive tract in the way of providing acid as a catalyst for breakdown of food, or prebiotic effects of starchy vegetables to help feed the gut microbiome. So not everything here, you know, you might see yellow or tan or beige or various graded scales of all of that. And sometimes yellow is lurking underneath green. In fact, I coined the term color density index, CDI, and you'll see in the paper that I wrote, when you look at the different foods to figure out which one gives you the most nutrient density in terms of color, there are some foods that contain red, orange, yellow, and green. And so when we get to green, you'll see how, green is my favorite color, by the way, I just have to say that. Green is ubiquitous in nature, and green often, because we have chlorophyll underneath the chlorophyll, and when it breaks down, you start to see all the carotenoids and the other things that you get. So kale is very abundant in lutein, which is a yellow compound. So usually when we think of yellow, you think of lutein, you think of the back of the eye, you think of vision, but it's actually found throughout the body, and also lutein is fat soluble. So citrus fruit, like grapefruit, or I think of lemons. Naringenin is a compound that can come from citrus fruit, and it's really interesting if you look at some of the studies, increasing metabolic efficiency at the cellular level by increasing AMP kinase, and also having changes in glucose and insulin that are favorable, that lead to reduced adiposity. If you choose, now this is a study where yellow is not favorable relative to purple. Whenever I see purple, when we get to purple, I'll mention this again, but whenever I see purple, I consider it precious because it doesn't occur very often in nature, and it's the color that people fall short on. So yellow potatoes cause a greater glycemic response than purple potatoes. Essentially, the smaller the potato, the less the glycemic impact, but purple in particular is very rich in the proanthocyanidins that help with glycemic response. I was having lunch with Dr. Jeff Bland some years ago. We were at a conference and we went out for some Chinese food. This was actually in San Francisco, I remember. And we were talking about, he asked me if I knew about the concept of Beijing. And at first I had no idea what he was talking about. I was thinking Beijing, China, or what does that mean? He said, no, Beijing, which means it's a process by which adipocytes or fat cells go from kind of their white, kind of the subcutaneous fat, white adipose tissue, which tends to get inflamed, which can move towards the spectrum of yellow, beige, brown, to the point that it becomes metabolically efficient, right? When babies are born, they have a higher percentage of brown fat to white fat. And oftentimes they generate a lot of heat, right? It's a different type of thermogenic fat. Well, the science would suggest, and I'm glad that he gave me that tip, because I went into the research, and basically we can change the nature, the phenotype of our adipocytes just with certain plant compounds. We can actually make them heat up better. We can create that beiging process with certain things like cinnamon. So we actually went into the literature and blogged on this. Cinnamon can help that browning process, which makes sense because cinnamon is also an insulin sensitizer. And resveratrol. Resveratrol is so good for so many things, but it also creates that kind of beige and brown adipocyte phenotype. So it's kind of interesting to see how we can change color in our body just through these phytonutrients. So back to lutein. Lutein is, as I mentioned, found abundantly in kale. I live in the Pacific Northwest, and here people love their kale. There's even the t-shirt where people are, it says, I love kale. Like people are really, kale grows really well here. We get a lot of green leafy veggies, especially kale. But if you look at this list, I do think that parsley is like the next kale. And we need to bring in different sources of lutein, different sources of vegetables to give us these different yellow. I mean, marigolds are also really high in yellow, obviously. But a lot of these greens Like one example is I do buy parsley. Sometimes I rotate between basil, cilantro, and parsley at the store, and I make sure I get, I wilt parsley just like in a stir fry, and make sure I get it just like I might get kale. And in some cases, I might be getting even more lutein than from kale. It kind of depends on the crop and how it's grown. But keep in mind that lutein goes hand in hand with another carotenoid called zeaxanthin. These two together do concentrate in the back of the eye and can help with things like night blindness. And another source that people don't think of very often with lutein and zeaxanthin is red bell pepper. Red bell pepper is high in both of them, not just lutein, but look at the difference there, right? So yeah, and corn, I'm not a huge fan of corn products, but corn is a yellow product that is pretty high in lutein and zeaxanthin. So I just mentioned how they collect in the back of the eye. In fact, the eye is one of the most rapidly changing tissues. I would hope that in the future that we can diagnose and do more with things like blood sugar changes, other changes, just by looking at the retina. I used to work with an ophthalmologist and an optometrist, and I just feel like, gosh, there's so much we can be doing, you know, the white of the eye. I mean, nutrition physical exam, one of the things you look at is the eyes, the eyebrows. You know, most of the information just from the face itself can tell us about nutrition, right? So the eyes are very telling, and vision can change depending on nutrients. So, and I learned from Dr. Pam Smith some years ago that we actually have estrogen receptors in the eye. So if you think about when people start to lose their sense of close in vision, they become farsighted, that seems to very much coincide with the loss of estrogen, right? So in the 40s, even in men, same as women, right? We tend to see that drop off. So this was a study looking at lutein, zeaxanthin, and other carotenoids in age-related macular degeneration. It's a very large study, and what they found was that higher intake of bioavailable lutein and zeaxanthin is associated with long-term reduced risk of advanced age-related macular degeneration. So if you care for your eyes, really important to get these yellow compounds. Skin health is also important. So this was a study in which they supplementally gave 6 milligrams of lutein, 0.18 milligrams of zeaxanthin for 8 weeks, and basically showed less peroxidation in the skin and better moisture of the skin. If we think of back to the digestive tract, taking in more citrus fruit is associated with less gastric cancer. So I often think, you know, there's so many great things in citrus, you know, having the zest of a lemon, the lemon juice, a lot of those bioflavonoids help to rev processes in the liver. I think of the yellow bile and how so many, you know, just the center of yellow in the body. It's the fire element, right? It's burning bright, it's rotting, it's ripening through acid. And a lot of these acidic foods might actually be catalysts for some of those processes. So this was an article talking about citrus flavonoids helping with some of these different organs, helping with liver toxicity and steatosis, kind of the fatty liver aspects. One of the foods that I have great passion for is honey. It's yellow, and I don't know if we would say it's a phytochemical per se. It is produced by an animal, but it's through connection with plants. And so I love honey. I have lots of different types of honeys in my kitchen because maybe it goes back to when I was stung by a swarm of bees one summer. And after that, I felt like I became the bee woman. I was really interested in all the different bee products, whether it's bee pollen, propolis, royal jelly, honey, and all of these different types of honeys. And what we see is that when it comes to sweeteners, there are a few studies showing that honey might even be favorable and helpful in states like type 2 diabetes. You know, honey is not just a sweetener, it's a composite of so many different actives, right? Immune actives. And as it says here, there's even a study, let me just see if I have, yeah, I have it here. this study was looking at a number of different honey varieties and showed that they had different polyphenol content. And what they were able to do is to help protect the cell from toxic exposures. And in this particular study, they were looking at glyphosate and chlorpyrifos. So it was helpful for preventing some of the DNA damage. So I think the bees, I have something with the bees. I mean, the bees give us food. They give us that life force. And, you know, there's so much that we can be learning from how they operate. And what makes a queen bee, by the way, is the royal jelly. And the royal jelly is high in methylation factors. So B vitamins are very replete and rich in royal jelly. Saffron is yellow, very expensive. And saffron, if you look at it, helps with components of metabolic syndrome. So that's important. There are also some studies looking at some of the actives in saffron helping with mood. Yellow onion. This was in 56 patients with a specific type of cancer. And so what they found was that the high onion group versus the low onion group had favorable parameters as it related to glucose and insulin. So just even yellow onion, pineapple juice. Sometimes if I've had, if I eat too close to bedtime and I happen to have a little bit of pineapple juice, I like to have it to help me break down food. You know, keep in mind when you think of yellow, think of catalytic activity, breakdown, whether it's through acid or enzymes. And pineapple juice, here's another example of using juice as medicine that it can help with, or even fresh pineapple. I actually have in the refrigerator right now a very ripe fresh pineapple that I keep diving into. What's really interesting, and a whole other talk on this one, but I'm very interested in the hormones of plant foods and how those hormones in plants can affect our hormones. So one of the things that I noticed from this study, and this is an old study, but I was digging it out when I was looking into the correlation of certain yellow foods. And what I found here is that plantains, pineapple, and banana are the 3 top high serotonin foods, which is really interesting, kind of the happy foods, right? We don't know if this translates. Like if I eat more pineapple, am I going to be a happier person? We don't have that kind of data. But I think it's interesting that these foods just tend to be high in serotonin. Ginger, don't forget about ginger being an anti-inflammatory, helps with the stomach, helps with nausea, helps with a lot of different gastric complaints. Cinnamon, cardamom, saffron, here's where we pull out the spices, and a lot of these are insulin sensitizing. So they're yellow or brown. You know, I feel like Americans can do better in the spice category. I think in a lot of other cultures, like in India, Iran, the Middle East in general, and certain parts of Africa, they're really good about using spices. In Europe, in certain parts, not so much. I happen to be Irish, Swedish, and I just don't find that, you know, we need to be using these spices, how medicinal they are. They're jam-packed with phytonutrients. So they can help with sensitizing our body to insulin. Curcumin, of course, which has so many different activities and also can help with blood glucose and insulin level. All right, so let me pause on yellow before we get into green. And then we have finally blue purple, and that'll be the end of the spectrum. Any comments about yellow? Spices, insulin sensitizing effects, catalytic effects, prebiotic effects from a lot of these starchy tubers that tend to be yellow or brown.
Have you noticed a difference in your issues with corn between yellow corn and blue corn?
I love your questions. Well, blue corn will be higher in other types of phytochemicals, right? I haven't seen a lot of studies that are comparative, but yes, I like the native corn varieties. I think that, you know, they tend to be smaller. They tend to be more nutrient dense. They're not modified like a lot of the starchy corn products that have been modified to be more sweet and starchy for taste reasons. So medicinally speaking, if we look at kind of like ancient corn, and if we look at just even ancient grains in general, we're starting to see more resurgence and emergence of these products back into the marketplace, right? Like we've lost something here. We have modified grains and starches so much that they just act like sugar in the body. So I think it's good that we go back to, like you're saying, like these native corns. And I think some areas of the market are actually starting to get into those more.
No other questions? Oh,
I would like to ask a question, but I don't know how to raise my hand.
We can hear you, so you can
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Oh, all right. I would like to know if food and nutrients are lost by being dehydrated, or in general by being, are they enhanced by fermentation, and is there a loss by dehydration?
Excellent question. I that's on top of everybody's minds. So with dehydration, heat, light, and oxygen degrade water-soluble nutrients. Now, conversely, those things, well, heat, I would say heat primarily, will amplify other nutrients like fat-soluble nutrients. So with dehydration, what you're doing is you're taking the water out, so you're concentrating the food. So there might be some losses, but you might also get some gains. So in the case of those dehydrated carrots, I don't necessarily see that as a negative thing. I think, again, having different food formats is important. So trying out different ones. But yes, you will lose, anytime you have heat, light, and oxygen, you're going to have some loss. The optimized method for cooking vegetables is steaming. So it's just a little bit of heat until the color becomes more vivid. That seems to coincide very nicely with a potentiation of the nutrients, or even the bioavailability of some of them, because the fibers are broken so that those phytonutrients can break free. Good question.
All right, thank you.
You bet. Okay, moving into green. Green is the heart. Green is about circulation, and there is no shortage of green foods. I feel like being on this planet, I think we're supposed to have a lot of green because it's the one that, this is a short list. There are many green foods, many varieties. And also within green foods, you tend to find some of the other colors. So you get methylation factors, a lot of the folates. I think that vitamin K is the next vitamin D. Vitamin K comes in different forms. Vitamin K1, also known as phytoquinone, is found in green leafy vegetables. So we have a lot of different types of nutrients in greens. This was an interesting study in which the authors looked at leaves or seeds to see which were more nutritious. And what they found was that leaves were higher in essential amino acids, which I thought was quite surprising. Vitamins like A, C, and K1, as I mentioned, and even some minerals. Now, that doesn't mean that you should never have seeds. I think, again, variety is important. Plants are all about light, and the green color, the chlorophyll, which is held in the chloroplast, is the vehicle for photosynthetic activity, which gives us the energy we need. So how do you store plants to optimize them? In as much as you can, and I thought that this is a very interesting study, many people put their greens in the refrigerator and they keep them in darkness. But keep in mind that plants are living even after they're picked. They're not automatically dead, they're living, they're life force, and they have a diurnal rhythm that coincides with the sun, much like we respond to the sun. So when we put them in a dark refrigerator, we start to lose some of their vitality. And in this particular study, what they showed was that kale and cabbage, being that they are high repositories of glucosinolates, which are important for metabolic detoxification, that they were actually at a higher level over time compared to when they were stored under being just dark, right? So there was something about cycling the light and having that. So it's difficult, because you can't keep everything on your countertop. It's hard to have constant, darkness in the refrigerator. It would be nice, but if you go, when I lived in Europe, I went to the grocery store every 3 days just because of this. I would buy smaller things, smaller amounts of things, and things were just more fresh. And so, just to keep this in mind that, if we cycle through, if we treat our plants like us, they would be having a very similar rhythm, right? And that's how we would maximize. In this particular study, again, seeing plants as, there's a great NPR podcast called Smarty Plants, if you want to listen, if you're really into plants. And it talks about the intelligence of plants and how they communicate. And so it's really interesting because in this particular publication that they had, just touching the plant allowed them to produce more antifungal type of compounds. Like they need a little bit of stress in their environment, but just not too much stress. And this is where organically grown food comes in, right? Now, another thing that greens are high in are nitrates. When people think of the word nitrate, they think that that's something bad. But in green leafy foods, you get naturally occurring nitrates. So here are some of the higher ones: celery, cress, chervil, lettuce, red beetroot, spinach, and rocket. And these are really high in nitrates. And so when you eat them and they contact your salivary microbiome, the process starts towards forming nitric oxide. So it's been estimated that one serving of a high nitrate vegetable like spinach results in more nitric oxide production than from what you can produce in your body just by itself. So why is nitric oxide important? It's a gas that causes vasodilation. So you can test. There are these nitric oxide strips that you can put on your tongue, and you can get a sense of your nitric oxide levels. You can just buy these online. For athletes, I've noticed, and when I test people on their nitric oxide levels, athletes tend to be very robust. Like their vasculature is open. They are, open vessels is a sign of good health, obviously. You do not want constriction or contraction. Then you have endothelial dysfunction. You might actually get erectile dysfunction. This is a vascular condition. You want nitric oxide, right? So one of the other things, in addition to spinach, is that including vitamin C and polyphenols from something like, just other foods can help to enhance the formation of nitric oxide. Avocado. Avocado is a power food. I think it's a great travel food. I do what's called the avocado taco, where I just open it up and squeeze it and eat it like it's a taco. Most people don't think of the avocado as being high in fiber, but if you eat a whole avocado, you're getting about 9.2 grams of fiber for a medium-sized avocado. It has more potassium than a banana, but yet everybody thinks of banana as potassium. A medium-sized banana has about 422 milligrams of potassium. As you can see here, a whole avocado is going to have 690 milligrams. Folate, monounsaturated fat. So it's not about the fat per se, it's about everything. It's a complete, it's a wonderful food, and it can be incorporated into a smoothie. It's a food for on the go. And this is a really neat study by Dr. Dave Heber's group at UCLA, in which they had hamburgers. So this was an acute meal study. They gave the subjects a hamburger, and then they measured their vasoconstriction after eating the burger. And what they found is that, yes, there was vasoconstriction, there were changes in lipids and inflammatory cytokines, but when they did the study again and had the burger with half of an avocado, they could negate a lot of those effects in vasoconstriction, and they could change inflammation. So, just kind of flatline that response that was elevated before. So again, it speaks to smart eating. What do we put together? If we want to have a burger, you're going to have a burger loaded up with spinach, avocado, and a bunch of greens so that you can bind a lot of these toxic things that form in the burger with cooking. Avocado consumption is associated with better diet quality and nutrient intake and lower metabolic syndrome. Again, I think it's a pretty accessible food. A lot of the greens tend to be bitter too. I think of green tea. I think of some of the soy-related products. Keep in mind that bitters, like arugula, a lot of these leafy greens, what they do is they they stimulate the gut in some way as well. So bitters, and in fact, you can test whether or not somebody is a super taster, a medium taster, or a non-taster of bitter. There are also taste strips where you can see whether or not somebody is a bitter taster. And if they are, they tend to be a bit more metabolically flexible than somebody who is not a bitter taster. So there's a lot of research on that. Brassica vegetables, green tea, soy, as I mentioned, tend to be higher in these bitter compounds. You know, I recently learned, well, not recently, it's been some years now, but we now know that bitter taste receptors are not just on the tongue. They're actually throughout the body. They're in the respiratory tract. They're in the brain. They're in the reproductive tract. It's pretty amazing how they're widespread throughout the body, that we're, you know, maybe they were incorrectly named by calling them taste receptors, but there's some kind of receptor that we are now identifying throughout the body that key into these bitter compounds. Broccoli, since it's green, let me just mention this. So frozen broccoli is not a good idea. You do not retain the efficacious sulforaphane that has a lot of the activity of broccoli. Of course, there are other things in broccoli. For example, there was just a study talking about broccoli leaves. You know, when you buy a huge stalk of broccoli and most people go after the floret, don't forget that the leaves on the stem part are actually really high in certain polyphenols and very high in fiber. And in fact, they're being looked at as a waste product because consumers don't tend to eat that part of broccoli, but it's very nutrient dense. So when it comes to broccoli, steaming, if you're just going to do the floret, steaming the floret for about 1 minute and 30 seconds to optimize the glucosinolates, the detoxification compounds. And one of the things I learned from the literature as well is adding powdered mustard seeds. Mustard is part of the cruciferous vegetable family, and it's hardy. It contains a more robust form of the enzyme myrosinase so that you can potentiate the formation of sulforaphane. So typically that kind of falls off with cooking, but mustard seeds together with some steamed broccoli can, again, give you more of the activity of what's in broccoli. Folate tends to be high in leafy veggies, and we see a reduction in breast cancer risk. You know, all kinds of, and I'm sure this group knows a lot about methylation. And so this is the green leafy vegetables that are really robust in a number of these different methylation factors. Microgreens, which are grown within about 7 days. So these aren't sprouts. Microgreens are a very distinct nutrient dense form of food that tend to be high in vitamin K, vitamin C, and carotenoids for the cilantro microgreens. And what I also like about the other facet of greens is that they're great binders. Chlorophyll is a great binder. So if I think of cilantro and coriander, sometimes those two terms are used interchangeably. Green tea, matcha, a lot of these green foods, spirulina, chlorella, we talk about them when we talk about binding toxic metals and taking them out of the body. So to be thinking about greens in general. Chlorophyll inhibits carcinogen uptake, reduces DNA adduct formation. So if there are toxic concerns, I always try to take some greens with me, whether it's spirulina or chlorella when I travel, just to make sure that whatever I'm taking in my food, if it's not always pure, that I can bind, take it out of the body. I won't get into methylation because I feel like that's a whole other, you know, it's a pretty deep topic, but I'm bringing it up here because green leafy vegetables are high in methylation factors. And if you're going to have a green smoothie, make sure you chew it. Keep it in the mouth for longer because then it will interact with the microbiome. You'll produce more nitric oxide than if you just slurp your smoothie. In fact, I think it's important. We don't want to lose our sense of chewing because chewing stimulates cognition, right? We have root fibers underneath all of our teeth that signal to the brain. So if we chew and we do not stimulate through mastication, through that chewing, then we're missing out on brain stimulation. So yes, I think smoothies are good, but not smoothies all the time. We need to chew. That's why we have teeth. All right. Any quick questions on green before I close with blue purple? All right. Anybody like blue purple? It's kind of one of those rare colors. It's either, yeah. So you like that. All right. So we got some blue purple lovers here. So blue purple is all about the brain. There's a lot. I've done a whole webinar just on blue purple foods and the brain because there's so much science. Like I can really pick out a lot. When I was writing that paper, this was a pretty robust section on things because it's all pointing towards the brain. Not exclusively, but to a large extent. So blue purple foods, what are they? This is a short list, right? We don't have so many. We think of berries. Berries are good in grapes, Concord grape juice. Right now in my kitchen, I have a purple sweet potato, but that's a rare thing. That's a seasonal thing that doesn't always show up in the stores. So we have to actively find and seek out purple rice, purple potatoes, plums are in season, figs, eggplant, purple cauliflower, purple broccoli. I always love seeing purple broccoli at the store, but that doesn't happen a lot. So when you get to choose purple, choose it. Purple is precious. And in fact, in this particular study, they showed that purple carrots, even though they look smaller and a bit more stringy than their starchy orange counterpart, they're more nutrient dense. You actually get a better nutrient density, more phytochemical index with them. Grapes are wonderful for helping with circulation. So we're helping the brain. Just think of how hard it is for the heart to pump and go against gravity. We've got to be sure that we open those blood vessels. So yes to green leafy vegetables. Anything that helps the heart is going to help the brain. So we know about grapeseed, we know about grape skin and resveratrol. There is a favorable effect of grapes and grape juice. In fact, red wine, I'm not a huge advocate. I know that this is a California-based group, but I'm not a huge fan of alcohol in general. I do think that you can get resveratrol not from just the red wine, but from grape juice. Like we don't have to have the alcohol with it. We can get it from purple grape juice. 100% juice can give us resveratrol as well. And I think we have to personalize, our approach to alcohol, right? It's not like we have to completely toss it out. I toss it out for myself. But I do think that for some people, small amounts, really good quality, not toxic, may be okay. In this particular study, they looked at grape juice, orange juice, and grapefruit juice and assessed platelet aggregation, like how clumpy the blood got. And they found that grape juice for 1 week reduced the whole blood platelet aggregation response by 77%. So think of circulation here also with brain and how you want to be facilitating that. So grape juice was very effective. It had approximately 3 times the total polyphenolic concentration of the citrus juices. Animals that received organic and conventional grape juice showed in frontal cortex an elevated BDNF level, brain-derived neurotropic factor. This is the cell signaling factor that makes neurons grow and perform well and gives them functionality. So you can actually change BDNF just through grape juice, right? Here's another study with grape juice. When they took about 8 ounces of purple grape juice or sugar match control in 20 healthy young adults. Now these are healthy people, no dementia here. What they showed was that they were able to improve memory and mood. 2 really important, and it's really hard to improve these things in people that are high functioning. But purple grape juice was able to do it and even help them to be more calm. There was another study showing that Concord grape juice helped with cognition and driving performance in these 25 women. Protective effect of raisins against memory impairment and oxidative stress in an Alzheimer's disease model. Raisins. Let's bring back raisins and berries, right? All of the different colors of berries. There's so much on blueberries. Supplementing with blueberry helped with hippocampal BDNF expression in this animal study. And that translated into better learning, So there are these structural and then functional aspects. Greater intake of blueberries and strawberries associated with slower rates of cognitive decline. If you're thinking about your brain, make sure you bring in blue foods, blue purple foods, and make sure that you bring them in on a regular basis. Berry foods mediate signaling pathways involved in neuronal plasticity. And what the work from Dr. James Joseph and others like at Tufts University found was that berries, the compounds, the colorful compounds in berries seem to localize in certain parts of the brain that are responsible for memory and learning. And they're also anti-glycative, so they're anti-aging. They help with just the overall senescent process of a cell. They help with repair. Daily blueberry consumption may reduce blood pressure and arterial stiffness. Right here, this was with a blueberry powder. A single serving of blueberry modulates peripheral arterial dysfunction induced by acute cigarette smoking in young people. Now, this does not mean that I would say you can smoke as long as you have blueberries, but it seemed to offset some of the damage done by that cigarette smoking. And you know, I'm always amazed by these studies in which they just use a single portion or it's just an acute amount. This is another one of those where a single portion of blueberry improves protection against DNA damage. And this was just even 1 hour after blueberry consumption. 1 hour. And we know that blueberry, the outer skin, is worked on by the gut microbiome, by different microorganisms, and helps to increase bifidobacteria, which is a beneficial class of microorganisms. So elagitanin is one of the compounds in berries that might have some effect and seems to be worked on by these microorganisms. But I think even there's so many different potential mechanisms. I think what we're interested in is what do they actually do? And yes, we do see that there are even clinical studies showing that blueberries improve cognition in people who are older. So not just the younger healthy group, but even looking at the older group in which they had a blueberry placebo or freeze-dried blueberry, which was an equivalent to 1 cup of fresh blueberries. So if you're thinking of how much do I need? Yes, roughly about ½ cup to a cup is about what we see in the studies. This was in children who were 7 to 10 years old, seeing that acute wild blueberry supplementation helped them with certain cognitive tasks. Another study on blueberry flavonoids so you see where I'm going with this. There's a lot of research. I'm not going to take you through the nitty-gritty here. It's late. But I want you to see the breadth of studies. And blackberries are even, I think blackberries are, they have a leg up over blueberries in some ways, because blackberries have a lot more surface area of skin than a blueberry. And the blackberry polyphenols seem to cross the blood-brain barrier. I also put in here like a cherry juice study, because sometimes cherry looks so red that it becomes that blue-purple color. And in this study, it was a 12-week study showing that cherry juice or control was tested. And what they found was after having cherry juice, improvements in verbal fluency, short-term memory, and long-term memory, as well as some cardiovascular improvements. All right. So white foods, there's not too much here. White foods, when I think of white, I think of white sugar, white flour, white salt, but there are some medicinal white foods as well. So I just kind of have a short list there. So I think where I want to leave you all is, you know, hopefully you feel a little bit of inspiration around having all these different colors. How do you know if you have enough? So what I did was I put together this list of just communicating to people why you want the rainbow, what, you know, basically where you can find it, how you can get it, and where you can get it from, like in your day-to-day living. So one of the ways that I quantify this with people, I do more or less group type of community type programs, is what I call the Eat the Rainbow food tracker. And in fact, this seems to have taken off with kids and families in the way of like a rainbow bingo, right? So you write into the circle, either you put a check mark if you've had it, or you can put a number if you want to count the number of servings. So that's something to track intake. And then here's a shopping list of a variety of different foods so that people can become, you know, out of sight, out of mind, right? So I always say, like, let's see it, keep it in your kitchen. So this can be used as a shopping list to prompt people as to what are some choices. And as you can see, the green list is quite long, right? I did not go into brown tan. I kind of included that in our discussion under yellow. So the Rainbow Toolkit, which you can all download from my website, deannaminich.com. You're free to use this for yourself. How do you know if you're getting enough in terms of laboratory markers? There are indirect measures to be looking at, but quite honestly, we have nothing perfect that measures a person's phytonutrient status. This is sorely lacking in the clinical sphere, unfortunately. So what would I say as we leave our discussion, right? What's most important here? I would say get variety, back to what Daniel was saying. Variety is the spice of life. I recently put on my Instagram page this phrase, dietary micro-rotation. I think we need small amounts of many different things. This builds resilience in the gut. Food diversity reduces food allergy, reduces the risk of overweight, and reduces the risk of metabolic syndrome, as we see with studies. And even Bruce Ames and a number of other people talk about, and for some reason, the research study, I believe this is Dr. Bruce Ames's work, botanical diversity is very important. Smaller amounts of many phytochemicals may have greater beneficial effects than larger amounts of fewer. So get spices in every meal. Get your daily smoothie if you feel like that's a good thing for you, and chew your smoothie. Drink tea, because I do think that tea is a wonderful source of phytonutrients. Soups and broths and stews can also be beneficial, even though we're subjecting heat. Again, sometimes we make other things more bioavailable, and to eat with the seasons. Eat warm, wholesome meals when digestive fire is less. Back to that question about food combining. When we don't feel like our gut is working very well, maybe we have to just segment, cook our food really well, introduce more of the fire element. And I do think that there's a place for bringing in synergy of all these different foods, right? So looking at potentiating, creating synergy with combinations of foods. And most of all, find a tribe that connects with fruits and vegetables, because your tribe determines whether or not you are eating fruits and veggies. So it's not always easy to get people to eat it because they don't feel supported. I love this quote from Jill Duplay, who said, and I saw this in a grocery store in Sydney, Australia. It said, don't eat vegetables because they are good for you. Eat them for one reason alone, because they are gorgeous. So I'll leave you with an eat the rainbow, be the rainbow. I'd like you to be thinking about, you know, what do you take away from all of this, right? A lot of information. I often say, if you can just take away 3 things and bring them into your life, you did well. I have a whole program that takes people through a 21-day color-coded way of eating different foods. And I have an omnivore track. I have a vegan track, so you can choose from whichever you prefer. So I'll stop there. And I think, gosh, I went right to the 9 o'clock mark. This is pretty late for everybody, huh?
Yes, this is our regular time for Thursdays here on the West Coast, and it's kind of unfortunate for people on the East Coast. I want to remind everybody to save the chat. All kinds of really cool stuff was put into the chat, and various links and stuff to Deanna's pages and the documents. And so down at the bottom of the screen, I don't know how to do it with a cell phone, but down at the bottom of the screen is a little place where there's 3 dots inside of a television kind of square. And if you click on that, you can save your chat on your computer system.
And next week we have Anthony Haynes, who is a European genius. I think he's one of the best healers I've found, and I've met many. And he's from the UK, co-founder of Nutrilink, and he'll be here talking about thyroid. He's another genius, so tune in.
I love
Anna, thank you very much. This was brilliant.
Thank you for having me, everybody. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our pleasure.
All right.
Deanna, you're gorgeous also, just like your veggies.
Yes.
Oh, goodness. That's very kind.
I'm the teller of truth.
Aw, thank you, Karen. Thanks, everybody. All right. Take care.
Many thank yous.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.